All right. Okay, so.
Sine cosine. 25.
Yeah, but you don't have.
All right, this is the last slide from Tuesday, right? So Tuesday, we were kind of talking about this section on kind of Greek mythology. And again, when we talk about mythology and myths and stuff like that, we're talking about stories that are embellished, right? They're not true, right? But, I still kind of discuss these with these early civilizations because essentially they're the belief system of a lot of these cultures. Not everybody, though, was on, particularly when we talk about, Aristotle. Aristotle thought a lot of these stories were kind of foolish, right? But for a lot of Greeks, this is a way to kind of explain things prior to kind of pre-scientific age. Also, they're kind of morality tales, a way to kind of explain the kind of human behavior as well. Because, like I said, a lot of the Greek gods, in particular, like the Olympians, they have some failings, right? They're not infallible. In particular, we talked about Zeus, right, as kind of constantly kind of stepping out on his marriage and stuff as being a kind of justification for some of the bad behavior maybe Greek men may have kind of engaged in to a certain degree. So on the test, like I said, there's going to be a matching section. It's going to be smaller than I normally have, but there'll be some Greek gods and goddesses that you'll need to kind of know, right? And so, like I said, the last one here being Dionysus. Sometimes Dionysus takes the place of Hestia. On Mount Olympus, the area where the gods are believed to live. He's the god of wine, everything kind of exciting and fun and stuff like that. But also, and you said, do you remember his Roman name? Remember his Roman name? It's Bacchus. Did I talk about how he's being twice born? Yeah. Right, the story of him being born from his
Zeus put him in his thigh.
Yeah, right. And he's also associated with theater. There was a cult of Dionysus that basically in the hills overlooking Delphi. That was only for women, and it kind of created men were kind of made up stories like what went down there. But they believe that's where the origins of kind of Greek theater arise. So a lot of later kind of they would have competitions and stuff on theater and stuff. They would be dedicated to Dionysus, right? And again, 3 months out of the year, he was the one responsible for the Oracle of Delphi. The other 9 months would be Apollo. So what I want to talk about today are these kind of entities that are kind of grouped together, right? In groups, and also these kind of disruptive deities that show the kind of more kind of animalistic nature of humans and heroes, right? So the first one being the Muses. The Muses were the 9 daughters of Zeus. And the goddess of memory, right? They were the ones who presided over intellectual and creative endeavors, right? So when you talk about anybody being a muse for someone, they're generally an inspiration. Now, the idea for a lot of artists and stuff like that is they would have a woman that would be their muse. It tends to be, because Greece is kind of patriarchal society, it tends to be kind of women who would inspire men. But that could be conversely as well. Anybody who kind of inspires someone. And so the muses were that you would have a muse specifically for, let's say, epic poetry. You'd have a muse for romantic poetry, for theater, history. Cleo is the muse for history. And so this is a way to kind of explain how people kind of create things. Yeah. Do you have a question? Oh, no, you're saying okay, raise your hand. Okay. And so the word museum comes from the muses, if you will. And so they're also associated with in many kind of artistic and illustrations with Apollo, all right, because Apollo is the god of music, right? So they're usually kind of associated with him in there. And then the Greeks are big at kind of putting kind of women in trios for whatever reason. One in particular, the Fates. They're the goddesses, and they're generally portrayed as these older women that basically control, determine human life and destiny. So this is where we get the idea your fate is sealed, if you will. All right. While they're associated with Zeus, Zeus can't change their decisions. All right. He has no kind of power over that. And so he would do certain things. That's why he would do things that we find kind of silly, like the story of Athena, the birth of Athena. Right. The idea was that he was told that Metis, who was the mother of Athena, that he would have a son after Athena with Metis that would replace it. Right. And we talk about how that's a kind of theme in kind of Greek mythology. So instead of just saying, you know what, maybe I won't mess with Metis here, all right, instead of that, he can't, that's already determined. That fate's already determined. So what he does is he tries to change it by swallowing Metis, That doesn't work. Athena is born anyway from the four-headed Zeus, if you will. All right, and so they're often sometimes referred to as the Moirae. All right, and so like generally, like I said, they're kind of portrayed as like kind of three older women. Clotho is the one who kind of unravels the kind of yarn that represents a person's life. And then there's one, Lesto, that essentially she kind of pulls the string on there that represents a person's lifespan. And then the one in the background there, it starts with an A, close. She cuts the string. What does that cutting of the string represent?
Someone died.
Yeah, someone died. Someone's dead. Okay. It used to be you guys used to have, like every year would have to do in English like a Shakespeare, like kind of like so I think freshman year you guys do Romeo and Juliet, right? Sophomore year is Julius Caesar. It used to be senior year was Macbeth. Right? I think they got rid of that some years ago. The beginning of Macbeth has these three witches that are basically kind of introducing the story and talking about the kind of story of Macbeth. That's Shakespeare's nod to the Moirae, to the fates there. All right. And so that's kind of like in Macbeth's kind of fate is already sealed no matter how like kind of the decisions that he makes to try to change that. And then you have the Araignées, all right, are also known as the Furies. I talked about them Tuesday. We were talking about that story between Cronus and Uranus, the father being replaced by the son, in which Cronus emasculates Uranus, and the blood from the emasculated genitals that reach the sea produced in one story Aphrodite, whose name means bone risen. Another story, she's the daughter of Zeus. But the blood that reaches the soil produces the Furies, the Araignées. They're the ones who basically would kind of torment those who killed their family members to the point of madness. All right. And so in probably one story that's probably most familiar, the most famous one with the Furies, there's a trilogy called the Agamemnon, all right, which talks about the story of Agamemnon, who was the king of Mycenae, who basically kind of led the Greeks in the Battle of Troy, right? He had to sacrifice his daughter to Artemis before he left. That didn't go well with his wife Clytemnestra, so when he returned from war, she had him killed, and then in turn Clytemnestra was killed by her son, who was tormented in the third part of the trilogy by the Furies, to the point where he eventually takes his own life. All right, so these were essentially the kind of like, for whatever reason, the kind of Greeks like to put things into trios, into threes. All right, and then you also have these disruptive deities that are kind of part human, part animal in that sense, to try to talk about the kind of animalistic nature of beings and such. One of the more famous ones are the satyrs, which have a torso, a human torso, and the hind legs of a goat. All right, they're usually associated with Dionysus. My references are pretty dated, so I used to say that they are the East Side Boys to Dionysus Littlejohn. And so they're usually associated because Dionysus is the god of wine with kind of like drunkenness and lust. I don't know if I've kind of made this clear. We talked about like Egyptians and Sumerians developing beer and stuff like that. Wine is similar. Wine is an alcoholic beverage. It's made from grapes. That when adults drink it, their moods tend to change. All right, depending on how much they ingest. You have to ask your health teachers there. So, and a lot of imagery of satyrs are on these wine jugs, these symposias, and some of them appear with a lot of phallic symbols. All right. A lot of imagery with kind of like satyrs and kind of these kind of phallic symbols that kind of like, they're the kind of good time kind of like figures within. But some of that could be, they're very handsy, if you will. All right. While not claimed to be a satyr, not often referred to as a satyr, a kind of close kind of imagery of that would be in front of our library there, the statue of Pan. If you've ever seen that, Pan is kind of a god that's associated with music and such. But he essentially kind of has the appearance of a satyr. In Roman mythology, they're referred to as fauns. Years ago, when I showed this, one of the first times I showed this imagery here, one of the kids goes, "Hey, is that you on the right?" And I just went with the story and made up a whole story that I can't remember. I think it came down to me like walking around like town just dressed as a satyr. This is from another Shakespearean play, A Midsummer Night's Dream. There's satyrs in that. So Shakespeare has a few nods to kind of Greek mythology in that sense. And then you have centaurs, which are half man. They have the kind of the torso of a human and the hind legs of a horse. There's male and female centaurs as well. A few years ago, Old Spice just had these commercials. I don't know if you remember that, where the guy was like, he's a centaur and he's in the shower and he's like, I'm two things in one. I'm a smart chopper and like a clean guy or something like that. You would think that he would mention that he was half man, half horse, but that was where the comedy was. Centaurs, though, tend to be kind of aggressive, all right? Whereas satyrs are kind of like drunken, good time kind of guys. Centaurs are a little bit more serious. To approach them, you have to approach them kind of cautiously. But there's other centaurs, like the most famous one being Chiron, who was a teacher. He taught like a lot of the heroes, like Achilles, all right? So there are some centaurs that kind of have the kind of are wise and kind of associated with wisdom. This is from a mosaic in a villa that was owned by the Emperor Hadrian, the Roman Emperor Hadrian, who, when we talk about Roman emperors, was fascinated with Greek culture. Right. This is called the Centaurs and the Wild Beasts, which kind of shows the centaur kind of basically throwing a rock here at a tiger. And then on the there was a frieze, this sculpture that was on the Parthenon for a long time until the 1800s, when the British chipped it off and sent it to the British Museum, which shows the kind of battle between the centaurs and their neighbors, the Lapiths, around Thessaly in that area. The Lapiths were believed to be the first of the Greeks to domesticate horses. So that's maybe where their anger is out with them. So this is, like I said, it was taken off of the Parthenon. And then you have sirens, but sometimes mixed in with the concept of harpies, which sirens were birds with women's heads who their songs would lure sailors to their deaths as they go into these rocky shoals. In later kind of artistic imagery, they're just kind of portrayed as women to a certain extent. The kind of most famous story that's related to kind of the sirens is in the story of the Odyssey with Odysseus. And on this attic, this base, you see the image here of a kind of siren kind of swooping down. In that story, Odysseus has his men put beeswax in their ears so they couldn't hear the siren singing. And then he tied himself to the mast of the ship to kind of call out orders on which way to go. They got pretty close. Did you ever see the brother? I don't know. I asked this. Oh, Brother, Where Art Thou? So in the movie of Brother, Where Art Thou, they're the women in the river that are washing clothes. Those are supposed to be the sirens, right? And then, like I said, in later artistic imagery, particularly getting the Renaissance and Baroque, they're just kind of portrayed as women. In a sense here, this was a kind of a way for the Greeks to kind of explain that women can lead men down to basically they can lead them down wrong paths to a certain extent. Again, this is kind of a male-dominated society. Men tend to make bad decisions on their own, though. They need to bring it to the Greeks. All right. And then you also have this concept of heroes, which plays a big role in mythology. Many of them are connections to gods like Zeus and stuff like that. Some are historical in nature, like the stories are kind of somewhat embellished. But they all kind of fit into that concept that we talked about, a rite, all right? The idea of what Joseph Campbell referred to as the hero's journeys, all right? And some of them predate like stories like the Iliad and the Odyssey. One of those is the story of Jason and the Argonauts, all right? Jason was this individual who was supposed to be the heir to the throne of this kingdom in Thessaly called Ilcus. But his grandfather was overthrown by his uncle, guy with the name of Peleus. And he was kind of exiled from there. And then in the story, like I said, like Hera, who's the kind of the sister wife of Zeus. In a lot of stories, Hera is she's very vindictive. In this story, she's a positive force. So in this story, Jason comes across to this older woman and helps her across a river. This older woman happens to be Hera, all right, and she tells him that he needs to go rightfully claim the throne from his uncle. In the process of helping her across the river, he loses one of his shoes, his sandals. Peleus was given a prophecy that if a man appears to his court with one sandal missing, one shoe missing, that he is basically the rightful heir to the throne as a challenger. So Jason happens to go to his uncle and say, "Hey, I should be the king." And he looks down and he's like, "Oh, this dude only got one shoe on." All right, he says, "Okay, that's fine. All right, I'll give you the crown if you go get the family heirloom." The heirloom happens to be this fur, basically the coat of this kind of magical ram. The problem is that it's all the way in this place called Colchis, which is like right in the eastern half of the Black Sea, and it's guarded by a dragon that never sleeps. So he says, if you can go do that, you and bring it back, then the crown's yours. So Jason's like, well, I got squat up. All right, so then he gets a whole bunch of heroes here. His boat is referred to as the Argo, and that's why they're referred to as the Argonauts. I want to play this kind of TED Ed video that kind of talks about the journey, and this is the quintessential kind of like journey where you're going all over the place, like the Odyssey.
Hercules, the strongest man alive with a mighty heart to match. Orpheus, charmer of nature and master of music. Castor and Pollux, the twin tricksters hatched from an egg. The Boreads, sons of the north wind who could hurtle through the air. For untold times, these heroes had roamed ancient Greece, creating new legends wherever they went. But none of their adventures was so great as when they joined forces for the sake of a young man named Jason. Years before, Jason's uncle Peleus had ruthlessly usurped the throne of Thessaly from Jason's grandfather. When Jason returned to his father's stolen court, the cowardly king set him a seemingly impossible task: cross the teeming seas to Colchis and steal the golden fleece of a flying ram under King Aeetes' nose. If Jason retrieved the fleece, Peleus promised to relinquish the throne. Touched by his heroic mission, the gods spread Jason's call for help, and soon he had assembled a not-so-motley crew. These heroes, alongside countless sailors, soothsayers, and rebel demigods, named themselves the Argonauts after their sturdy ship. But the path ahead was marked with untold terrors, enough to test even the fiercest heroes. Their first stop was Lemnos, an isle of women who had killed all the island's men. As punishment, Aphrodite had cursed them with a sickening stench, but that didn't stop Jason fathering twins with the queen. The rest of the crew also found themselves embroiled in new romances until Hercules chastised them for not behaving like heroes. Eventually, they sailed on to the Mount of Bears, an island where a group of ancient six-armed monsters lived alongside the peaceful Daliones. While the clan welcomed the Argonauts with open arms, the monsters surged down from the mountains and hurled rocks at the docked ship. Hercules held them off single-handedly before his comrades joined the fray. Bolstered by their victory, the triumphant heroes sailed onward, only to be blown back to the island several stormy nights later. In the tempest, the Daliones thought these new arrivals invaders. The Argonauts were similarly unaware of their surroundings and fought blunderingly in the dark, slaying wave after wave of foe. But the morning light revealed a horrible truth. Their victims were none other than their previous hosts. Yet again, Jason had allowed the crew to be distracted, this time at a terrible cost. Ashamed at his conduct, he resolved to focus only on the fleece, but even this haste proved ruinous. When Hercules' squire was abducted by a water nymph, Jason sailed on, oblivious to the absence of his most powerful crewmate. The remaining Argonauts continued their quest until stopping at the sight of an old man surrounded by a swirl of harpies. This was Phineus, a seer cursed by Zeus to endure old age, blindness, and endless torture for giving away his prophecies. Moved by his plight, the Wind brothers set upon the flock, providing Phineus with a brief respite from his punishment. In return, the seer told them how to overcome the terrifying trial that lay ahead. The Symplegades, a pair of clashing rocks that reduced ships to splinters. But first, the Argonauts would have to maneuver past the mouth of hell, around the island of the bloodthirsty Amazons, and under psychedelic skies. These adventures cost the crew both in men and morale, and some feared they might be losing their minds. Upon reaching the clashing rocks, the exhausted crew quaked with fear, but Phineus's advice rang in their heads. The Argonauts released a single dove and sped through in its wake to emerge unscathed. With this narrow escape, the Argonauts finally had Colchis in their sights. Yet while Jason rested and celebrated with his crew, he could feel his time among them was drawing to a close. As the fleece gleamed in his mind, he knew he would have to retrieve it alone. But he could not guess that this final task would have the most horrible price of all.
So, after that, he kind of goes on his own and reaches Colchis there. But he wouldn't have got the golden fleece if it wasn't for the king of Colchis's daughter, Medea, who basically they kind of fell in love. And Medea was kind of had witchcraft powers. She kind of essentially basically gave everything up for Jason. She turned against her family. She cast a spell which led to her brother's death. She also cast a spell on her sisters, and essentially they ended up chopping up their father unknowingly and putting him into a stew. All right. And so she cast a spell on the dragon that held him go to sleep, and he gets the golden fleece and returns to Thessaly with it. And this is from an attic from a kind of a vase there that kind of shows Hera kind of overseeing seeing the situation. So like I said, Hera is kind of a positive force. Now later, the story of Jason and Medea plays out in a trilogy focused on Medea, in which Jason ends up basically divorcing her for what they would say call a younger model, a woman who was whose father was the king of Corinth. All right, and so Medea has nothing. Basically, she gave up everything for Jason, and what she ends up doing is something drastic, where she ends up killing their children and herself. And so this is the quintessential what we call like a Greek tragedy. We'll talk about like kind of Greek tragedies like when we got back from Thanksgiving. And so it's also that the play kind of like talks about how, unfortunately, a lot of times for Greek women, their fate is tied in with their husbands in this kind of male-dominated society. I'm not totally sure, though, if Tyler Perry got the concept of his Medea from that Medea. There's some differences in the story to a certain extent. But that's where the name originates. And then probably the most famous kind of hero within the pantheon there is what the Greeks refer to as Heracles. All right, what the Romans refer to, what we tend to call Hercules, right? And so Heracles was a member of the Argo. Like I said there, he ends up leaving after his shield bearer, right? Kind of falls overboard. In one story, he's taken by the water nymphs, and those story drowns. All right. And while he's named after Hera, Hera is not his mother. His mother is a mortal by the name of Alchemy. Essentially, when Hera tries to, like we're in the story of Jason Argonauts, where she's a positive force, she's the exact opposite in here. Matter of fact, she tries to kill him when he's an infant. She sends 2 serpents into his crib, and Heracles is kind of like the quintessential individual who doesn't quite understand his strength usually. And he takes those serpents. When his mother comes in, he's holding the serpents like rattles. He basically strangles them to death. So Hera at one point casts a spell on Hercules, and he ends up killing his family unknowingly. Then he goes to the Oracle of Delphi, and he has to basically kind of make that up. And there he has the Oracle tells him to go visit his cousin, who was a king, to basically make this up by going and do these what they call the labors of Hercules. Initially there were 10, but they eventually became 12. In kind of some of the stories, Hercules is kind of like this kind of guy he's kind of maybe a dumb oaf, all right, in some stories, but in the 12 labors, it shows his kind of like his ability to kind of think on his feet, to kind of come to the, basically to complete the task. So I'm going to show this other TED Ed, but it's a little shorter one, it's a little bit longer, but it explains the 12 labors in an 8-bit video game setting, which I kind of think is kind of interesting. I got one more note here, so I'll put your stuff down.
Hercules, son of Zeus and champion of humankind, gazed in horror as he realized he had just committed the most unspeakable crime imaginable. The goddess Hera, who hated Hercules for being born of her husband's adultery, had stricken him with a temporary curse of madness and his own family with casualties. Consumed by grief, Hercules sought out the Oracle of Delphi, who told him the path to atonement laid with his cousin, King Eurystheus of Tiryns, a favorite of Hera's. Eurystheus hoped to humiliate Hercules with 10 impossible tasks that pitted him against invincible monsters and unfathomable forces. Instead, the king set the stage for an epic series of adventures that would come to be known as the Labors of Hercules. The first labor was to slay the Nemean lion who kidnapped women and devoured warriors. Its golden fur was impervious to arrows, but Hercules cornered the lion in its dark cave, stunned it with a club and strangled it with his
bare hands. He found no tool sharp enough to skin the beast until the goddess Athena suggested using one of its own claws. Hercules returned to Tiryns wearing the lion's hide, frightening King Eurystheus so much that he hid in a wine jar. From then on, Hercules was ordered to present his trophies at a safe distance. The second target was the Lernaean Hydra, a giant serpent with many heads. Hercules fought fiercely, but every time he cut one head off, two more grew in its place. The battle was hopeless until his nephew, Iolaus, thought to cauterize the necks with fire, keeping their heads from regrowing. The dead serpent's remains became the Hydra constellation. Instead of slaying a beast, Hercules next had to catch one alive. The Ceryneian hind was a female deer so fast it could outrun an arrow. Hercules tracked it for a year, finally trapping it in the northern land of Hyperborea. The animal turned out to be sacred to Artemis, goddess of the hunt, and Hercules swore to return it. When Eurystheus saw the hind, he demanded to keep it instead, but as soon as Hercules let go, the animal ran to its mistress. Thus, Hercules completed his task without breaking his promise. The fourth mission was to capture the Erymanthian boar, which had ravaged many fields. Advised by the wise centaur Charon, Hercules trapped it by chasing it into thick snow. For the fifth task, there were no animals, just their leftovers. The stables where King Augeas kept his hundreds of divine cattle had not been maintained in ages. Hercules promised to clean them in one day if he could keep 1/10 of their livestock. Augeas expected the hero to fail. Instead, Hercules dug massive trenches, rerouting two nearby rivers to flow through the stables until they were spotless. Next came three more beastly foes, each requiring a clever strategy to defeat him. The carnivorous Stymphalian birds nested in an impenetrable swamp, but Hercules used Athena's special rattle to frighten them into the air, at which point he shot them down. No mortal could stand before the Cretan bull's mad rampage, but a chokehold from behind did the trick. And the mad king Diomedes, who had trained his horses to devour his guests, got a taste of his own medicine when Hercules wrestled him into his own stables. The ensuing feast calmed the beasts enough for Hercules to bind their mouths. But the ninth labor involved someone more dangerous than any beast, Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. Hercules was to retrieve the belt given to her by her father, Ares, the god of war. He sailed to the Amazon land of Themyscira, prepared for battle, but the queen was so impressed with the hero and his exploits that she gave the belt willingly. For his 10th labor, Hercules had to steal a herd of magical red cattle from Geryon, a giant with 3 heads and 3 bodies. On his way, Hercules was so annoyed by the Libyan desert heat that he shot an arrow at the sun. The sun god, Helios, admired the hero's strength and lent his chariot for the journey to the island of Erythea. There, Hercules fought off Geryon's herdsman and his 2-headed dog before killing the giant himself. That should have been the end, but Eurystheus announced the 2 labors hadn't counted: the Hydra, because Iolaus had helped Hercules kill it, and the stables, because he'd accepted payment. And so the hero set about his 11th task, obtaining golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides nymphs. Hercules began by catching the old man of the sea and holding the shape-shifting water god until he revealed the garden's location. Once there, the hero found the Titan, Atlas, holding up the heavens. Hercules offered to take his place if Atlas would retrieve the apples. Atlas eagerly complied, but Hercules then tricked him into trading places again, escaping with apples in hand. The 12th and final task was to bring back Cerberus, the the three-headed hound guarding the underworld. Helped by Hermes and Athena, Hercules descended and met Hades himself. The Lord of the Dead allowed Hercules to take the beast if he could do it without weapons, which he achieved by grabbing all three of his heads at once. When he presented the hound to a horrified Eurystheus, the king finally declared the hero's service complete. After 12 years of toil, Hercules had redeemed the tragic deaths of his family and earned a place in the divine pantheon. But his victory held an even deeper importance. In overcoming the chaotic and monstrous forces of the world, the hero swept away what remained of the Titans' primordial order, reshaping it into one where humanity could thrive. Through his labors, Hercules tamed the world's madness by atoning for his own.
And Hercules is like, later he dies, right? He's shot by a poison arrow. He gets to live on Mount Olympus and stuff like that. He's kind of worshipped as a god. There's numerous temples that are dedicated to him, like in Sicily and stuff. There's numerous statues. Like this one is in Berlin. Shows him with the Olympian boar. But even like in Eastern cultures, in a region referred to as Bactria, which is essentially like Afghanistan today, there was a kind of a Buddhist presence there that mixed with kind of Greek, and so in one sense, there's a story in which he is what they call a bodhisattva. He is a protector of the Buddha. He goes by the name of Baharana. All right, and so there's kind of that, and also too in Spain, if you ever look on the flag of Spain, there's two pillars. Those are known as the Pillars of Hercules. That's after he basically kind of like broke through and kind of created the Straits of Gibraltar after the 10th labor that he did. All right, so that's kind of associated. So he kind of transcends like a lot of the kind of the past the Greek world and stuff. All right, and then the last one to kind of show you kind of like the idea of a Greek tragedy, where not all the Greeks aren't big fans of, let's say, kind of happy endings. There's the story of Oedipus Rex, which is told in a later play by Euripides. We'll talk about that when we talk about Greek theater and stuff. But in Oedipus is a king who unknowingly kills his father, then marries his mother. Right? And how that story goes is that his father was the king of Thebes, a biological father, and when the king went to the Oracle of Delphi, the Oracle said, "Your son is going to kill you and marry your mother." And he was like, "Oh no, he's not." So he basically took the infant and basically set him out in the elements and said, "That is that." Kid was picked up by a shepherd and then sent to Corinth, raised by the king of Corinth. All right. And then what ends up happening is while he's traveling, he comes across a kind of a group of people that they thought were kind of bandits. They happen to be his biological father. He ends up killing him in a skirmish. Then when he goes to Thebes is basically being ravaged by a mythological character referred to as the Sphinx, which is a winged character. The only way to basically stop the Sphinx from his ravaging the city is to solve its riddle. You guys know what the riddle of the Sphinx is?
What's the
Well, that's 4 legs in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 3 in the
3 in the afternoon, and that, of course, is
humans.
you, man. So the 4 legs represents infants. That's the early part of your life in the morning. Afternoon is the height of your life, as being walking on 2 legs, and then the evening represents elderly, with a cane. After defeating the Sphinx and kind of sending on his way, he ends up marrying the widow queen of Thebes, who happens to be.
Seniors, you are now dismissed.
Bro, are they not just the Avengers of the?
Yeah. There's a lot of that stuff is great.
No.